Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from the African Academy of Sciences. With you here this afternoon is Grace Mwaura. I'm the one who will be facilitating this webinar. And we have Professor Charl Faul, who will be the panelist for today. This webinar is a continuation of a webinar we had last month on how to set up and manage your own research lab. So most of you who have been able to join this webinar either registered to attend that webinar or attended the previous one. The format will therefore be a little different in that we'll first respond to the questions that were posed during the last webinar and we not respond to. And if any additional questions come up, we'll also respond to them. So a few instructions on how we are going to run the webinar. You will all be on mute and webinar because you're too many, we can't have everyone speak in, but you can ask questions by typing them in at the questions tab or the chat tab. So if you have any question, type it in there. I will be able to see who you are and what your question is, and will be able to respond to you. So right now, I'm going to hand over to Charl, who is going to start by reading out the question that is going to be responding to. It may be just by one person, but we know it's going to be relevant to many of you, and then we'll take it from there. Over to you, Charl.
Great. Hi, everyone. So great to be back again and to have the opportunity to answer some of the questions. So thank you for the introduction, Grace. So I just want to point out to all of you that the handouts and as a PDF of my presentation is available. You should see it on the webinar interface. And if you can download that from there and have a look. And also my contact details in case you have further questions at a later stage. You should feel free to contact me. So there were quite a few questions from the webinar, which was roughly a month ago, which we didn't get to respond to. So Grace very kindly put those together for me, and I've just worked through those early on, and so I'll just be going through those one by one, and hopefully that would answer some of the things that you might have in your mind as questions. But also I would encourage you to make use of the interface and post further questions if we've not covered those in the questions that I'll answer already. So the first one is a question about the gap between two grants. So the question is, what are some of the productive or creative things a researcher can do when there's a gap in between two research grants? So I think the very simple answer to that would be to use your time as wisely as possible. That kind of maybe sounds like an obvious thing, but if you have a gap between grants in terms of time, make sure that you use the time to read more papers, make sure that you're up to speed with the latest developments in your field, write those papers which you know that you've not had the time to do yet. Make sure that you work on your publication list, your publication record. So use that time to maybe write a review, which can be very useful for your profile. Make sure that you maybe send some emails and make contacts with editors of journals that you've maybe published in already. Ask them if they would be interested in a review in a specific area from an early career researcher. Very often nowadays journals have early career issues, early career researcher issues. You could always ask if they have something like that and that you could contribute to that. And of course, plan your next grant. If you have some time to sit down and think about your next grant and start with an outline and start writing. So I think, those gaps can be frustrating because maybe there's a kind of a slowdown in certain aspects, but at the same time, I would encourage you to use that time because actually having a bit of extra time for thinking and planning is a real luxury, and you should really enjoy having that. So that would be the first question that I was posed. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is about your career and pathways forward. So the question was, how easy is it to focus your career in a different direction from your PhD focus? Yes, I mean, changing research direction can be quite challenging. But I think this is the crucial aspect here is to have experience outside your home laboratory. So if you have had the chance to do a postdoc, that's the time to kind of learn additional skill or gather additional skills, or maybe to slightly move your focus out of your area where you did your PhD. if you think, well, actually, I've not had the opportunity to do a year or 2 years abroad in somebody else's lab as a postdoc, I've already started my fellowship. You could always think of taking a short break, a 3-month research visit somewhere, and do that in a targeted fashion to maybe gain a specific skill. If you know you want to move into a specific area, to maybe join a lab for a few months and just make contact, build your own network, and gain the skills, so that actually then transferring from your PhD areas and kind of moving into a new area could be enabled by getting the correct skills. I think this is really important, having those additional skills and making or looking for opportunities to gain those skills when you, especially when you want to change your focus a little bit, is really very, very important. You need to get to know the scientific community as well. So going to an active lab and maybe then joining a research conference or two in the area would be other ways to help you to shift. Okay, so I think those were the initial two on career pathways. And then there were two further questions on funding. So, of course, funding is a really crucial part of what we do. And so the first question is, how do you start if you have a small grant that does not guarantee financial support for the students, and being in an African institution that does not support students either? So I'll be honest, funding stays always a tricky issue. Yeah. So all I can say is try and focus and be as productive as possible with the resources you have, even if you think they are not much. If you have the opportunity to take those things on board, take what you have and focus. Yeah. Focus by maybe spending, if you don't have enough people of your own, to spend some time in the lab. Get enough data together to publish your first paper in your new institution. And maybe think of creative ways to engage with students, even if there isn't any specific financial support. Maybe there's an opportunity for you to engage with undergraduate students by offering some short projects in your lab, some internships or kind of summer experience where students come in for a short period of time. I think as a new academic staff member, very often it's hard to get the profile to attract students and to make students aware of who you are. And I think if you have the opportunity to engage with students, maybe through teaching labs or even suggesting a new teaching lab activity, which is based around your research, all of these will help you to lift your profile. And maybe also then in that way, sort of thinking of or providing opportunities to find funding, especially if you have a successful kind of activity over summer. The other thing, which is of course is important, is to engage with the local and the wider funding bodies. So make sure that you use time that you have to talk to, for instance, people at the African Academy of Sciences, look online at what funding opportunities there are, encourage students to apply for short supports or fellowships for them to spend time in your lab. So I have a steady stream of people who apply in their own home country for short study abroad periods. So they come to my lab from anything between a month up to a year, and they are usually funded by their home country, which gives them opportunity to experience some scientific mobility, gain some skills, but of course that gives me also the opportunity to add some further students to activities in my lab. So yes, I can only encourage you to think creatively about how to engage with students in a wide as possible range of activities to hopefully attract some students and potentially some self-funded students, or maybe some small project money from your university locally to engage with your research. Okay, so I hope that answers that question, and then I'll move on to the next one concerning funding. Is where can I find the money specifically for setting up and building my own lab? And once again, I can only encourage you to look at the, let's say, local funding. Maybe there are very small pots of money available within your own institution. These can be very helpful to kickstart or a small project or to do a proof of principle study. Look at your national funding agency, engage with them. There might be specific programs for early career researchers. Otherwise, write to a program manager. Maybe there's a chemistry or physics program. Introduce yourself, make yourself known to them. Of course, look at other wider funding activities, international funding activities. For instance, the Royal Society. If you're a chemist like me, the Royal Society of Chemistry actually has a number of small bursaries for mobility, for conferences, for activities related to international exchanges. Institute of Physics have similar ones. There are various other kind of opportunities, and once again, engage with the African Academy of Sciences and look for a list of funding and available funding opportunities. So the TWAS have some opportunities which they publish on a regular basis, and sign up for some newsletters and make yourself known and go out there and look for funding. It's not necessarily always easy, but once you start to build up a database, make sure that you are aware of when the funding deadlines are. And if you miss the funding deadline this year, put it in your diary well in advance so that you can apply and kind of engage with that funding opportunity in the next year. So I think by having a kind of a steady stream of applications going, you have the opportunity to build up your own ideas, explore them, make sure that they are valid, and then use them for funding applications. And if you do apply for funding, you should always ask for some feedback, and if at all possible, to learn from your funding applications that have gone in, especially if they are not successful, which will happen, and try and get some feedback so that you can increase the quality of your future funding applications. Good. So I think that brings us to the end of the funding questions. And then, so now there are a whole range of questions about growing and managing your own team. So, yeah, of course, as scientists, we need people to help us in the labs, and therefore we need students or postdocs or people to engage with us. And I think the first question here is, what is the best strategy for identifying and recruiting students with good potential? So, yeah, even more important than just having people. I think we all have maybe seen some examples of where students who do not engage take up a lot of time, far more so than the students who do engage.
Sorry, Charl, I'll interrupt you a bit. Your sound sounds like you've moved away from your mic, but just for a few seconds.
Okay, so I'll make sure that I.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just see. So how much of the last question come through? The last, or this question on growing and managing your team?
About 20 seconds, not more than 20 seconds. So it's okay. Yeah.
Okay, my apologies. So the question here that I'm dealing with is, what is the best strategy for identifying and recruiting students with good potential? So I think, of course, we all want good students in the lab. And so the real way, or one of the ways to deal with this, is to find a balance between your own profile, your own visibility, advertising, and of course, with that, you have to back that up with publishing good papers so that your research area and your research group will be attractive to students. You have to think about it from their perspective. Would they join a group that has no profile? Would they join a group that does not do something which seems interesting, or they're not publishing any international papers? I think you have to make yourself attractive to students. And then, of course, have an open and welcoming attitude. But at the same time, I think very importantly, to have a very rigorous kind of underlying approach, which means not just saying yes to every student, but to have a kind of a system where you invite them to apply, maybe formally, provide you with a CV, maybe 2 letters of reference. You might have an informal interview or opportunity for a quick phone call or a Skype meeting. All of those things, I think, will be helpful for you to form an opinion of a candidate other than just looking at a CV. Getting input from their referees will help you to form a kind of a broader, kind of maybe more fuller picture. And so in that way, you have to also ask yourself what you are looking for and what the skills you are looking for in students. So this kind of spills over into the next question, which says, You mentioned not being very picky with choosing your hands in the lab in the beginning, but what do you do? What do you look out for now, assuming that you're more picky? Yeah, so certainly I've become more picky, carefully thinking about the students and the type of activities or traits that I'm looking for. A proactive student, somebody who writes to me by name rather than just a dear sir or madam type email. Somebody who engages, who obviously has done their research, they've done their homework, they've looked up my website, they ask me sensible questions about my research, they are asking for experience or looking for opportunities. All of those are indicators of a proactive student, somebody who's looking to engage and to widen their experience and their own CV. So, and of course, these are the types of students that I would love to have in my group. I look for, when they send CVs, at the quality of what they've written. Did they take care to do something which is neatly presented in a formal way? Of course, I look at their letters of references if they've provided. I also look for evidence for excellence. Did they win any prizes, maybe as an undergraduate student? Were they active in a society, on university, on campus? Anything that would set them apart from other students. Once again, looking for indicators of success and indicators of ways in which I can judge how proactive and successful they are. And so, yeah, those are the types of things that I would do. But it's tricky. It's a balance between having people in the lab and looking for good people. And sometimes we are fortunate that we get good people at the right time when we need them, and other times not. And that is part of building your own research group. That is part and parcel of what we have to deal with on a regular basis. So I hope that that's given some, let's say, practical insight into how to select and look for good students. So then the issue of corresponding author came up again, and I think we spoke a little bit about that last time as well. I mentioned that in my presentation. So the question was, how do you deal with this corresponding author issue? For some disciplines, it is obvious that it is the PI, and for some other, it is the student or researcher who performed the largest part of the study. So I would kind of first once again say that this could be a tricky situation, but there are some simple rules that I follow, at least from a kind of a physical sciences / chemistry perspective. So as the person who is in charge of the lab and who provides the guidance and the direction of the research and probably provides most of the resources, I would see myself as the corresponding author, especially if it's a field that we are developing and I am the lead PI in this area. So that would mean, at least in the chemical sciences, that I would be the corresponding author. Of course, if I have a joint activity, a joint student with a colleague, I think it's just fair that if we have both provided input and direction, that both of us would be corresponding authors. The question, of course, is then if the PI is the corresponding author or the two PIs are co-corresponding authors, who goes first on the paper? And I usually follow the following rules. They work quite well for my laboratories and with my collaborations, but this might be different, of course, for you. But personally, I'm not aware of any situation, at least in the physical sciences, where a student would be corresponding author. A student would be the person who's done the bulk of the work, would be the first author. And then in my lab, the person who's done the bulk of the work would be the first author, followed by other students who contributed. And finally, at the end of the authors list, I would put myself as the corresponding author if I led that study. And that just means that, that provides clear indication and also recognition to the student for the work that they've done, but also provides clear opportunity for people following the work of the group to know that this work is from my lab and related to the activities that I lead. Of course, if you have done most of the work, but you are also the PI, it could be that you could be first author and corresponding author. But as your student numbers will grow in your group, you will see that that will probably change. And I would always suggest to put the student who's done the bulk of the work as the first author, because that means on their CV, they are known as the first author of that paper. But it's very clear that you have led the study because you would be designated as the corresponding author. Of course, if you have a senior colleague who is involved in your work, you have to think carefully about if I would say then in that case it would be co-corresponding author if there's no other way out. But certainly if you want to build your own profile, I would suggest that you also make it clear to them that you need to become independent and successful in your own right, and therefore would also need to be one of the corresponding authors. So I think that brings me to another aspect of a question, say, which was asked during your earlier career. Senior professors expect you to adjust your research agenda to theirs. And how do you build your independence without disappointing them or clashing with them? Yeah, this once again can be tricky, but I think first and foremost depends on your level of independence. If you're really just starting out, it might be more tricky. If you're already a bit further along in your career, you might have a bit more of a leg to stand on in discussions. But I would always suggest to have a conversation about your future plans with a senior colleague, maybe your mentor or the head of the department, and try and explain to them that, yeah, if you are successful and you can become independent and lead a successful independent research group, that the department, of course, will benefit from this. And yes, sometimes it will be a negotiation, yeah, where maybe you're making use of resources of a senior colleague, and then to have a conversation so that it becomes clear what their expectations are, what your expectations are, and where these overlap. This might not be easy, I can also understand that, but I think the more you engage in conversation and the more you communicate your desire to be successful but also independent and the potential benefits for your home department, hopefully this will provide you with an opportunity to really carve out your own independent career. Okay, so before we move on to the next part of these questions, there's one more left under growing and managing your teams. And this was related to the following. So the question is, when you are in the beginning of your career, sometimes you're not able to answer your team members' questions during meetings. How do you handle these situations without losing credibility towards your team? And I understand that if you are only slightly more senior than the students in your group, you might feel a little bit uneasy. But of course, you must remember that by default, you will have more experience, that you will have better understanding of the field that you already have been working in for some years. But it doesn't mean that you'll know everything. So if a question comes along that you really do not know the answer, I would always be as open and honest. And for example, say, well, actually, I've not thought about the problem from this angle. Let me go away and think about this, and I'll get back to you next week at our group meeting. This gives you the opportunity to go away, think, prepare something, and then respond, because it might well be that other group members in your group would have had similar questions. But the important thing which I do then is I put these answers in a wiki for the group. And this is an online resource we have available where students can then post or go back and look at questions and answers provided, so that actually that becomes a resource from which your students can learn. And if the same question comes up, you can just say, well, actually, I've answered that question last year. Why don't you go and look at the wiki? And if you have further questions, please come back to me. So this gives you an opportunity to build up your own knowledge again, but also have a kind of a library of answers available to your group as it grows. And you don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel and repeat yourself on a regular basis. You could always think of having a, let's say, half-day research questions day where you maybe book a room in your department and sit down with students and get them to prepare maybe some answers to some general questions which arise from your group. And this gives students the opportunity to engage with questions and come up with answers. And this way, once again, build up a database of questions with answers related to your research activity, which could really be very valuable in the long run. Of course, that means that as students join, they will have a library of activities that they can, of course, just go to, have a look and learn from, and come back better informed about the research activities in your group. Okay, so we are about, let's say, just over halfway through the questions. So if you have any further questions which have not been answered in areas of careers, funding, and growing and managing your team, then, or even managing expectations here, please feel free to post those and we'll try and answer them as well. So now I would like to continue with the last few questions. So the first few are focused on project management. So there was a question about project-related software and which are particularly useful for keeping tabs on your student project progress. So I think I mentioned last time that yes, there are a number of these. So Slack is one of them, which is a kind of a way to very easily and quickly stay in contact with students, share information. Trello is a kind of a board type approach where you have project boards. There are many others which I am not so familiar with, Zoom and Toggle. Actually, this is something which you should go and explore if you feel you need that. Decide on, well, do a little bit of reading, a bit of research, and then decide on which one of those you want to use. But more importantly, you have to get your students to engage with this software as well, so that you can work together with them. I make use of regular PowerPoint updates in my group, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But in that way, that helps me to keep up to date with what my students are doing on a regular basis. You might find one of these other programs are more helpful. But as I say, I think it's important that your students will also engage with those. Yeah. So maybe I can just, I'll speak about the ways that I run my group and how I do this also in terms of other activities in just a minute. The next question in this area of project management is the following. What would you consider to be the key functions that are required for a research group? For example, a business will have marketing, finance, and operations, etc. What might be the equivalent functions for a research group? I think from the name already, we should say research and scholarship should be at the front of your mind when you think of your research. So which means that you have to engage academically with the questions in mind, that you should ensure that your students are producing work of high quality, that you have very rigorous research practices in place in your lab. Of course, especially if you are at the start of your career and you are spending some time, this is the best way to transfer those research practices to your students by teaching them, showing them what you mean by making sure that the research practices are embedded in your students right from the start. This also means that you have the function of supporting your students, mentoring them. Yeah, this is of course very important for kind of rigorous scholarship and rigorous research practices, that the students know and are being taught what to do. And of course, looking at ways to share knowledge and expertise in your group. And this might be through a wiki or through regular seminars or regular question and answer sessions in your group. I think one of the other key functions, of course, is producing regular scientific output, whether that be papers, usually review papers, experimental papers, practical, maybe some engagement, or maybe writing for a newspaper or doing a radio show, but some output where your students can also see and experience what you are doing when they try and look at what you are doing objectively. So within those, I think the next thing that would lead from all of these activities is just renewal of your ideas. As you have more students joining and more projects, you will see that that becomes, once again, something which you have to adapt to, apply your rigorous scholarship and research practices, support students, produce outputs, and in that way continue to produce and function as a research group. So the last question concerning project management was the following. So could you please elaborate more on the factors to consider when deciding on the number of projects to get involved? i.e. how thin or wide should one stretch themselves? Once again, this is a tricky one, especially if there's money involved. And so I would always, first and foremost, argue, especially for a young early career researcher, is to build a profile so that people will say, Dr. X is the person who is working in this specific research field, or Dr. Y is well known, or is the person who is doing this in our department. So this gives you the opportunity to build a profile. But this might mean that sometimes you have to let go of some projects which are a little bit, let's say, left field from what you are doing. And I think it's important to, especially if you are trying to build up a profile, that you do this very carefully. Of course, if there are some clear benefits to getting involved in an additional project, whether this is project funds or resources or maybe access to students, you have to weigh that up against the ability to focus and build your own profile. But my concern is when, or not only early career researcher, but when researchers spread themselves too thin by getting involved in too many projects, and their efforts are so diluted that they lose profile in the process. And if people do not know what you do, it becomes very hard then to build a profile to become known as the person who is solving this big problem, who is getting grant income in this area. And so I would always very carefully work. And sometimes it's good just to make a list of pros and cons getting involved. And if you can see that there are some specific advantages, then I would suggest that you do. If the advantages are not clear, I would suggest that you very carefully and very politely try and not get involved in yet another project which will just further dilute your own efforts. Okay, so thinking about not only project management but also time management. Yeah, there was a question about the structure of my week, and the person said in this question they have a team of 20 people, and this has happened very fast, all within 3 years. So it's an overwhelming task, and it's a 24/7 job. And so I can understand the potential here. We are looking for money, we are looking for people, and then suddenly things really take off, and then you have to learn very quickly to deal with a totally different volume of work. So my advice here would be to be very organized. And so I can give you a kind of a rundown of my typical week. So of course, we will all have other duties to do, administrative, teaching duties, maybe duties within your wider institution or even for funding bodies. But I have a very strict rule that I try to stay with at all times, is that I really ensure that I set, at this moment in time, I have the ability to put 1.5 days aside for research only. So Mondays is my research day, unless, of course, it's for the African Academy of Sciences. I don't accept any other meetings on a Monday, and I only engage with my students. So every one of my students, so my group is around, I think, 24 people. Each and every one of my students have a dedicated slot once per month for an hour where they have to produce a PowerPoint, which they have to send to me before their individual meeting. This gives me the opportunity to see what they have done. And so the structure of this PowerPoint is fixed. So they have to state the title, the overall aim and objectives of their project, and then give an update on what they've done in the last 4 weeks, what they are busy with currently, and what they are planning for the next 4 weeks. So this helps students to become critical, think about their own projects objectively, to plan. It also gives me the opportunity to keep up with what they are doing. But very importantly, also, this gives students the opportunity to produce a series of PowerPoints throughout their study period, whether it's a master's or PhD, where all of their information is already in digital form. So when it comes to writing a thesis, all of the structures have already been drawn, all of the data have already been kind of produced in electronic format. We've already discussed everything. That makes the process of writing so much easier. So that's on a Monday, and towards the end of the day on a Monday, so I see between 4, maybe about 6 students. So that is over the month. So it's 6 students every Monday for an hour. And then at the end of the day, I also have a walk-in session for 2 hours or something like that, where any student can come and see me unprepared, just to come and ask some questions. I also have my research group meeting on a Monday, and this is also run by one of my students. So I give students a chance to act as chairpersons for these meetings, so they learn how to chair meetings. But also they know exactly who has to provide a research update, and of course, who will be providing cake for the meeting, which is also very important. So yeah, so that is a Monday. So individual meetings, research group meeting, and walk-in session. And then on a Thursday from 12 o'clock onwards, I have an open walk-in session and paper writing sessions with my students, where they can come and sit down and talk, and we can either solve problems or work together on writing papers. And so I try and keep those specific times free from any other meetings. And mostly that is respected by my colleagues, because I'm available on the other days for administrative, teaching, and other duties. So back to the original question, how do you manage your team? Please find a way that will work for you, but be very organized and be strict with your students. If they don't turn up for a meeting, sternly worded email to point out the fact that they've missed an opportunity to get input in their project is really helpful. Yeah, to make them aware that actually if they don't turn up for a meeting, they are wasting their own time as well as your time. And I think that is part of creating a culture in the group where you are friendly and open to engage with your students, but at the same time fair, and make sure that they understand that you are willing to give your time for their projects, but that also requires engagement from their side. And so in that way, hopefully that will lead to a productive environment that you can keep on top of all the projects, you can keep on top of progress, and of course, yeah, make sure that you look after your students in the best possible way. And then this seems to be the last question from this list here, is really a little bit about time and project management, but also about your kind of work-life balance and work-family balance. So the question was, how do you manage staying away for long periods from family, especially when money is really needed? So I know that, of course, all of us do not have ideal working circumstances. We might not work in the same place where our families are based. And this can be especially tricky at the start of your career, when probably you are also thinking of building up your own family, or you already have a young family. I think you have to be really practical there. Try and make some specific times to catch up with your family, whether this is by phone or by Skype or by WhatsApp or by email, whichever is appropriate, so that they know that you are connected to them on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And I would book those times into my own calendar to make sure that I catch up. I spend a fair bit of time away from my family, and we try to be very kind of rigorous in setting time aside to catch up regularly. If that is not possible and you can only go and visit on, say, certain periods, then please ask your colleagues to respect the times that you are with your family. Because, of course, if you are at work for most of the rest of the year, there are some times where you really need to switch off and just be with your family. And if you can do this in such a way that you set an example also for your students, and you respect the fact that, or they learn to respect the fact that actually you are available for large periods of the year, but there are also times when you are available for only your family. I think that's a good example to set. But it might not be easy. And once again, I think we should learn to make use of technology in a kind of creative way, so that we actually try and either spend time with our families in that way, or even if we want to spend longer times with our family, to engage also with our working environment in a kind of a remote way, so that we might even create more space to spend with our families. So I think that brings me to the end of my questions that I had. So I don't know, Grace, if you've had any further questions come in.
Thanks so much, Charl. Yeah, and yes, we do have questions, and I hope everyone who has been listening in has benefited from those responses. I think that we have enough time, so they are quite deep. So there are two questions that have come through now that you haven't been talking about. So I'll just read them out to you, Charl.
Okay.
So the first one, is from Rosemary, and it relates to funding. Are there any funding opportunities where researchers in advanced laboratories can partner with researchers in developing countries to ship some basic equipment which are no longer needed by the advanced laboratories? So I want to believe Rosemary here is referring to researchers, for example, in the UK or Europe, and who may want to collaborate with researchers in developing countries like Cameroon or the like. Might you have any information with regards to that?
Okay, so I'm not aware of any specific schemes, but I think this is where one of the ways to kind of creatively engage with this issue might be through building up your own network of collaborators, where you have the opportunity maybe to visit labs and build personal relationships, so that that becomes maybe an opportunity for you to discuss with the PI of that lab and make them aware of the fact that actually they might have some equipment which they're not using anymore, which might be of use to you in your kind of environment. Yeah, I'm not aware of any specific schemes like that. Maybe Grace might be aware, but I think that's something as an opportunity to be explored in the future, because certainly there are places where equipment is not being used, where it certainly could be used and put to good use in other places. I think it's to connect the people on both sides and the equipment and the needs up in a sensible way, but certainly there's room for improvement there.
Thanks, Charl. And the next question, perhaps before I read this one, I would ask for those who are listening, if you have any question, this is the best time to type it in, and Charl will be responding to it. So this is a question from Caroline. And the question goes, the challenge I have is knowing or understanding my worth as a PhD researcher, especially after my PhD when I apply for jobs. She says she's in a social science PhD. Is there a criteria to use to assess how I should be selling my skill set for a research or project job, considering if one, you don't have much work experience before your PhD, and when two, you have little bit of experience, say 4 years before your PhDs? I hope this makes sense.
Okay.
Over to Charl.
Yeah, so actually I think it's really important that, yeah, as we continue in our career, that we take the time to objectively evaluate the skills that we have learned and we have kind of gathered as we've gone along. So for instance, if you're doing a PhD, yeah, the obvious skills you can talk about is maybe teamwork, solving complex problems in a complex environment, engaging maybe, if you're on the social sciences, maybe maybe engaging with your subjects that you are investigating or part of your research, maybe doing interviews, people skills, those transferable skills which you could take into any kind of job situation or employment situation. Of course, you also have other skills like your technical skills. You would be used to working in a technical environment, working with computers, probably very proficient in using a range of different software. So I think all of those are maybe skills that you don't immediately think of. But of course, I think the other skill is assimilating large amounts of data and turning that into digestible form and concentrating that by kind of writing reports. You have good writing skills, good skills to summarize things. You have presentation skills, because I'm sure you would have had the chance to present your work, stand in front of an audience. Maybe you've had some public engagement opportunities. So even if you don't have formal employment or experience from during or before your PhD, you probably will be surprised if you sit down and think about the things that you do on a daily basis, of the types of skills that you've already gathered. I think it's important here to also do a bit of reading and look at what types of skills are discussed and are required, and ask yourself, actually, when I apply for this job, they require this type of skills. Do I not have an opportunity where I might have already engaged with them? But I think, yes, it's very easy to only focus on what we do on a day-to-day basis. It's probably useful to every now and then try and take a step back and objectively look at the things which you just take for granted, but that might already be very attractive to potential employers out there. Maybe one way to do that in a more targeted way is to look at job adverts and see the types of skills that they ask for. Let's say you want to become involved in policy or policy making and policy decisions, and you see some advertisements for those types of opportunities. Look at the skills they require. If you have the opportunity in your own institution, maybe try and join a training course. Or if there aren't any available, look for some online training opportunities so that you build up your own skill set. You can build your own CV. So I think there are lots of things that you can do, because I'm sure that at a PhD level you are already innovative, you've already learned to deal with complex problems, so this would just be another problem that you could easily tackle and turn into an opportunity for your future career opportunities. Great, so I hope that answered the question. Okay,
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, and I'm back. Okay. On to the next question. Thank you so much, Charles, so far. This is from Mlambo. The question is, at what point in your research would there be need to employ a research manager, and what typical functions would they be expected to fulfill?
Okay,
at what point in your research would there be need to employ a research manager, and what typical functions would they be expected to fulfill?
Right. Okay. Thank you, Grace. So I think that so this would, of course, once again depend from field to field and even institution or country to country. So typically in the UK, if you are senior and very successful and run a very large group, you can expect to be able to employ a research manager. For somebody at the start of their career, I think the expectation is that you would manage your own research group. I think there's real advantage in doing that, because of course you learn a lot by working with people and doing lots of the things yourself, lots of hands-on experience. So of course, if you are in a position where you maybe start to branch out, your group grows, and you have funding available, you have to, of course, ask yourself, would it make sense to have somebody help me to take responsibility for the research? It might be that you work in a government laboratory and there's an opportunity to appoint a research manager. So I think this is probably going to vary, but I would say that you have to ensure that the volume of work that such a person should do should be enough. Otherwise, the question is, why are you not just doing it yourself? I would say the types of functions that you would give to a person like that is to maybe make sure, let's say you have some repetitive or important activities, maybe cell growing, and making sure that your cell labs are up and running according to the correct protocols, that you have somebody who has to take responsibility for day-to-day running of certain aspects of your lab, things which are crucial to the research but might not require research input or research level input. Yeah, and it might be that you see that actually you could get by with some technical support rather than a research manager. I think, yeah, this would be open for the type of environment that you're working in, to really identify clearly the types of functions and activities, and then the right person to help with that. So that would be kind of my short answer on when and what functions a research manager should do.
Thanks so much, Charl. So this is not a question, it's a comment, and I'll read it out for the rest of the people to hear the suggestion. There was a previous question from Rosemary about where to get equipment from. There's a suggestion that there is a group called Seeding Labs. It's normally promoted by TWAS, that's the World Academy of Sciences. You should check it out. Check out their website. I was also thinking about it. So if you can go to Seeding Labs website and see if it's possible for you to collaborate with other institutions to get the equipment. And Victor says that 3 of his labs have benefited from this about 3 years ago. So that's good sharing of information. So I don't have any other question on this side unless there's anyone trying to type in a question. Yeah.
Well, I think, I mean, if there are no immediate further questions, I can only suggest to people to maybe take the time just to go over the PowerPoint slides again. My contact details are on there. You have Grace's contact details. And if there are further questions, just to email them. And then I think what could be useful is if these are shared, that maybe Grace will see that this might form part of a future webinar and could direct you to attend a future webinar, or otherwise we could try and answer the questions directly. So this would all be viable options to make sure that we can support you guys in whichever way is required.
Yes, that's very true. Charl would love to run future webinars. So if you're listening in and you have suggestions on a topic that you'd like us to discuss at a future webinar, feel free to type it in or send us an email. You will have our email address from the emails you've been receiving with regards to this webinar. Let us know any other topics that you may have. We've realized the webinars are actually filling up very, very fast. We have a webinar coming up next week on why we fail in grant writing. We announced last week, and as of last Friday, actually within 4 days, we had 100 participants registered for the webinar. I think it's now almost full, or it's already full. If you want to sign up for that, you should have that maybe on your newsletter, the AAS newsletter. So do sign up. Let us know what webinars you may require. We plan to run this once a month, but if there's high demand and we get fantastic panelists as we have, Charl, then we'll keep running even more than once a month. And given the scenario we have of coronavirus, we might go online for most of our events also as an academy. Rosemary, I'll send you an email on Seeding Labs, but I'll just type the answer in for everyone to see. Exceeding as in a seed. I think there's sort of one last question for you, Charl, to take for the next 2 minutes before we end the webinar from Temitope, and she's asking, sorry, this is to me actually. You're asking if I can sign up for the webinar on grant writing. Unfortunately, if you can try to sign up now, but I suspect it's full. If it's full, we may have to plan for a second one for that. So always be on the lookout for that.
Okay, so I think I could maybe just add a kind of a general comment as well. So for you all as early career researchers to actually look on the web, not only the African Academy of Sciences, but there are many other websites who provide some real practical information and guidance on writing, on starting your labs. We've shared some of the activities. I've shared some of my resources. I see that Grace has added further PDF on setting up a lab. And I think that there are lots of opportunities to learn from other people. Will take a little bit of maybe research, but I'm sure that all of you with a few minutes spare can find some additional resources to give some help. But as I said, feel free to contact and ask for help, and we can only direct you, or we can of course try and answer or direct you to other resources that we are aware of. Very good. So I'm not sure if there are any further questions at this point, Grace.
None from this side, Charl. And so I'll take this opportunity to maybe say we've come to the end of the webinar today. And thank you very much for, again, leading us so well, responding to all those questions. I think we really had a really productive webinar last time and this session as well. So we really appreciate your support through these webinars. As I've said, if you have any suggestions, once you receive the email on the webinars, feel free to email us with your suggestions, and we are happy to look for speakers and to run those webinars in the coming months. So thank you very much, our participants. Thank you very much, Charl, and all of you have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Yeah, take care.